Ross's bike since forever has been on this stand, and it's about to come very delicately down.
If I were you, I'd take it off there and put it on the floor.
And then I'd put it in a van and
Easy.
For those of you who've been down to Bike Shed Shoreditch, you might recognise this blue Honda that's been sitting up in the shop with products and t-shirts and caps and things draped all over it. This is in fact my 1966 Honda CL77, and I'll give you a brief background on the bike itself and the model, and then I'll tell you about how I rebuilt it a few years ago. So for me, this bike started Bike Shed for me. I built this 5 odd years ago, and it was sending a picture of this to Dutch to say, would you like this for the second Bike Shed show, that got me introduced to him and Vicky, and then, as we know, the rest is history. So the bike itself is a 1966 CL77 or a Honda 305 Scrambler. These were brought out by Honda in the early 60s, and in 1962 there was a 250 version called a CL72, and Dave Aitkins, Bud Aitkins' brother, was given a CL72 with his mate, I think Brian Robinson, and they did the inaugural run from Tijuana to La Paz, 1,000 miles. It was 1,032 miles, and that became the Baja Rally. So this bike started the Baja 1000. They rode all the way there on 2 bikes, unassisted. Planes would fly over and drop bags of cement to show them where fuel dumps were. I think they did it 38 hours, something like that, non-stop. One of the bikes was running on 1 cylinder for half the way, so he stopped at the end, and I think Dave spun around and rode all the way back to Tijuana and back to the Honda dealership. So I didn't know about any of that until I bought the bike. I was actually after a CL350 at an auction, but I didn't have brass balls that day and I didn't bid high enough. So I found this unrestored non-runner on eBay. It had a seized engine. I had it delivered and started out on what was to be just a restoration process. But I hadn't heard of the Bike Shed back then. I'd sort of every now and again looked at Bike Exif, but I bought this classic bike and I wanted to make myself a green lane tool for getting to work because I lived in the countryside. So, as I said, the bike itself was, it was really good condition, but the engine was seized. I think it had been sat in a shed, and on the, if I remember rightly, the left cylinder, the valves must have been open, condensation sat in there for decades, and the piston rings rusted themselves to the cylinder bore. And I tried diesel down the bore, I tried lighter fluid, I tried knocking it with a hammer, I tried everything, and after a week it wasn't going to give, so I had to get a bit brutal with it and strip it all out. So what started out as a quick, I think I can probably get this running and I've got myself a bike and maybe trim the mudguards up, turned into a typical me job of getting completely carried away. And as you'll see from the pictures that Dan's putting in now, I took it back to a completely bare frame, stripped the engine. I didn't go quite back to the crank. I had the whole, both barrels off, top end apart, and yeah, really started from scratch. But the remarkable thing is, and I'm 100% convinced of this, the mileage on this is currently 1892. I've put 1,000 of those on. This, as far as I'm concerned, is genuine mileage. So I had 892 miles on it when I got it. Now, I didn't get any history with it. It was an import from the States. It was in a batch of, I think, 26 CLs of various engine sizes that came from Appleton, Wisconsin, a few years prior to me getting it. But you know, when you take something apart and you know that a bolt has never been undone and all the heads had never been touched sort of post-factory. And it wasn't until later, getting it all back together and trying to run it, that I found out the condenser was knackered and it was only running on 1 cylinder. And the handlebars were bent, and underneath the dodgy paint job there was a massive lump of filler in the side of the tank. So my historical guesstimate is someone had it as a fun tool, crashed it, something went wrong, couldn't get it running again, and then just left it in the shed for, I don't know, 30 years. But let's wait for that siren to fuck off. But you know, back in the 60s, these were Honda's attempt to take on Triumph and BSA with the street scrambler market. And in the States, you could ride one of these at 15 or 16, and certainly the 250. A lot of college kids, if they had the money, would ride these. They were cheaper, more reliable than the Brit bikes of the time. They didn't shit fuel and oil and guts everywhere. So as you'll see from the pictures that Dan's going to put in, this tank had a fist-sized piece of filler in the side of it, and I thought I'd be clever and weld a little washer on and try and use a slide hammer to pull the dent out, and I just ended up taking a chunk clean out the side of the tank. So I had to braze that, fill that, try and maintain this seam here that runs down the centre of the tank. So I actually got a bit of help from the paint guy, and he just was tapping it with the tiniest little pin hammer just to bring that seam back. Silver soldered on a brass neck. I cut a hole in the top of the tank, sunk a brass neck in, silver soldered it on, and then popped this Monza tank on. And yes, technically it does face the wrong way, but I didn't want to try and force another turn on the thread. I actually quite like it that way anyway. Original Honda badges, and I made the geeky effort of making sure that the screw heads face the same way on both sides and a level. That's just a geeky point. As mentioned, the engine was completely rebuilt. I went to huge lengths to get original Honda pistons sent over from the States. I had one piston from one side of the States, one piston from the other, piston rings from somewhere else. I had gudgeon pins, or wrist pins if you're American, from Kawasaki GPZ or something, and then had to turn them down to fit, which actually is a slightly contentious issue because I was convinced at the time that they were a little bit baggy. Well, the pin was a bit too small, and there is a slight top end rattle, and I'm convinced that I need to put some new gudgeon pins in. But I wish I had put Wissaco high compression pistons in. For some reason I was on this path of I'm going to restore this, and because of the low mileage it will be a collector's item, but it's not. I mean, Jim Morrison had one of these, Elvis Presley had one of these, and the fully restored one's still not worth stacks of money, which is a bloody shame, because technically only 4 of these ever came to the country legitimately. So yeah, engine wise, bottom end was all good, top end is all brand new, vapor blasted all the cases, refrained from putting any paint on. I just like the slightly patinated look. The pipes, believe it or not, are completely original. People think I made them. All I did was sandblast the chrome, and then just with a 3M Scotch-Brite pad, brush them. I hate chrome, so that had to go. I don't know if you can see these bits down, but probably my favourite bit on the bike are these silencers. Now, they're called snuffle knots, or snuff nuts as they became known. So this is a straight through pipe until you turn those, and then you get actually quite a bit of baffling, and it cuts the noise. The year after this, I think in '67, you had this horrible spark arrestor. I think the Californian law stated that you couldn't have straight through pipes, so they had this big old nasty thing on the back. While you're there, Dan, I'll just point these out. These are shocks off a CB something or other eBay job. I welded this bracket on. I think that was after I decided that I wasn't going to fully restore the bike and it would start to become a little bit custom. These are slightly too stiff for this bike, and it does make the ride, for me, a little bit hard. But again, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. It was all eBay bits, so I had to machine some bushes to accept these shocks. Wheels were in perfectly good condition. All the spokes were the correct tension. Even the brake shoes were within manufacturer's tolerance of the first service. I mean, the bike, as I say, has barely done a thing. So I didn't have to do much with that. So powder coated the frame black. The seat though was a longer seat, and it was heavy and ugly. So I made this base. Now, I probably shouldn't show you this because it was my first ever attempt at making a seat, and probably not the finest job in the world. But I tried to do as good a job as I possibly could. So Dan, don't zoom in too much underneath here. The frame itself is standard. I haven't chopped anything off. There would have been a standard, a loop on there as standard. This is the, just cover that bit up because that's properly gash. So ribbed aluminium base. I put some plywood strips in the side here to allow the upholsterer to get his staples in, but I've since seen with so many custom builders that they just glue it all on. So I perhaps shouldn't have gone to that much trouble. And as you can see, it's been a bit of trial and error trying to make it fit the stock frame. But I wanted something that was easy to take off so I could get at the battery. I did have some combination indicators and tail lights mounted onto here, but they just looked a bit ugly. I then had these little indicators plugged in there, which I found on eBay well before all this Moto Gadget pins and tiny stuff even existed. This latest bodge is just a tiny stoplight. Might have a bit of, there we go, and all I did was just notch out the back of that recently so that it's not the most wonderful fit in the world, so that just sits under there, and as you see it's got tape and what have you on it, but I think that's enough to keep the MOT man happy and stop me getting in too much trouble. And I am allowed one of these number plates because it's old, but just in case you need to park somewhere where there's a warden, I've got that easily removable. Proper leather. I found a guy who repaired sofas for a living. We went upstairs in his backstreet sofa shop, and he had hide after hide after hide hanging up, and I chose this one because it was as close as I could get to a sort of horse's saddle. That was the look and the colour I was after. I've obviously designed this to cover the frame rails of the stock bike, but it is a little bit too wide and it's a bit uncomfortable. Might look cool, but it's a little bit in the groin. Mud guards, alley mud guards. These are straight out of the Hitchcock catalogue. They're from Royal Enfield something. They're a C profile stock 19-inch mud guard, and I think they were 35 quid each or something. So cut them both down, trim that one to fit, and obviously trim the front one to fit, and then brush them with the Scotch-Brite again. In fact, before I spin it around down, these headlight ears I made as well. Before I could weld alley, so I just tacked them and then gave them to a proper bloke to do them. So these bosses are welded onto this bit of tube, which I just slit down the back. And again, before Motor Gadget gave us the pleasure of little pin indicators, I found these on eBay. I never found them since. A little bit proud of the bracket, but hey, it's handmade. And I thought that was a really good solution, but I've since taken all of that off and I just use my hands, and I find that's sufficient. Well, especially when the bloody bike just sits in the shop the whole time anyway. But I'll spin it around for you, Dan. Tyres was the other thing you asked me about earlier. These are a road legal trials tyre, Ensign is the make. Standard wheels, 19-inch front and back with these fairly robust deep steel rims. They're still not alley. So you can see from this side some other mods I made were these pegs. I've got a pic I can show you down. They did have a big rubber boot over there, but I just bought these trials extension pieces and then brazed those on to give a bit more grip, because like I say, I was supposed to use this as a green lane bike for getting to work. I had about an 8-mile run to work, and I could have done it without touching a single road. Sadly, I never quite got the chance. Perhaps one of my other favourite bits is the tool roll holder. Now this came with all the original tools in a nice Honda tool roll, again untouched, but my colleagues at my previous company where I built the bike decided that they'd give me a leaving present when I left the job of this lovely tool roll with a nice little message, stop being a so thanks for that, guys. Don't quite know what they meant by that. I was an exemplary employee. Other little details, this key surround which holds this side panel on. One of the machinists at the previous company turned that up for me, and that would have had the paper air filters behind here. Now I tried with pod filters and it just would not run. It would not rev out. So I think mid test ride I picked those up and threw them off. I've used the standard intake tracks, and then I've just cable tied some foam socks from a Weber 45 that was bolted to a race car at the time, and they've worked fine. So I've never really upgraded since. And while we're talking about carbs and throttles, this is a Venhill Speedway throttle, quick action. So that's your lot, shut, flat out. Blasted it to get rid of all the black paint, and then stuck it in the rumbler just to make it look a little bit older. And these are the original grips. You probably can't see quite how slippy they are, but they're shiny and not very good, but they're squidgy and I quite like them, and they suit my big hands. I've bent the side stand mount. I think Dan's got a picture of Mallet Mile a couple of years ago, so I got this old tatty number from. Coming back from a busted shoulder injury, I thought I'd do the Mallet Mile and break myself in gently for the rest of the flat track season, and I managed to crash within 10 seconds of jumping on the bike. Quite dramatic picture, so Dan, stick that one in. So although this has been sat in the shop for the last couple of years and I've not done much with it, it's not really a bike for riding around London. I did toy with the idea of entering the vintage class in the DTRA flat track series, but all the nice stuff is down this side, and I don't want to drop it and mess up these pipes, so you just can't get them anymore. But later on, 15th of September, I think that's the date, Bike Shed Sunday Scramble up at just north of Stevenage. I'll be taking this around and giving some of the the younger bikes a run for their money. So we're going to see if it runs. We did have a little trial run earlier, and I managed to forget to fit the battery last time I used it, so I've just been and got one, and we'll give it a whirl. Now if it starts first, second, third kick, then I'll take the credit for building a really good engine. If it doesn't, I'll blame the shit fuel that was in there. Oh, it's close. There we go. Second kick. I'm not going to rev it too hard now, but I'll just close these snuff nuts so you can hear the difference. They're pretty effective. So one of the reasons I love this engine so much is it's a really free revving thing. I think it goes to about 9–10,000, and it's got a 180-degree crank, so it sounds gnarly and nasty. So I'm just going to close these doors behind me so we can give it a good rev so you can hear what it sounds like. That's pretty good, isn't it? That's not bad, is it, for what are we on now? 52-year-old bike. It's been sat in the shop since DGR 2016. Fresh fuel in it, second kick, off it goes. I'll take the credit for that, for building a nice engine. So apparently I'm not allowed to ride around the arches anymore. After my last episode when we got the keys 3 years ago, Dan, cut to the video. That's apple juice anyway, it's not fuel. We're definitely not taking fuel out of a bike at the bike shed. That was early, so Vicky's not here, but this is definitely not happening.